Is Swedish hard to learn or is it a relatively easy language? Well, first of all, that depends on what you mean by learning Swedish. Do you want to order a glass of beer somewhere in Malmö? I can teach you that in 3 minutes. Do you want to study law in Uppsala? That will take a little bit longer. But I guess what you wanted to say is Swedish hard to learn compared to other languages, to languages like Chinese or Arabic or Spanish or whatever? And here I could tell you, yes, it's definitely easier. The reason for that is that the Swedish language is in the same language family as the English language, the Germanic languages as they are called. You might guess that German is also in that family. And these languages are relatively similar. They share a great deal of vocabulary. Actually, many Swedish words got into the English language in the Viking era. So there are many words that you will just recognize. I'm throwing 3 examples here at you. I guess even if I hadn't told you what the English translations are, you would have guessed what these words mean in English. But also the Swedish grammar is fortunately not very complicated. If you look at Spanish verbs or Russian nouns, you will have pages of grammar tables, and you can skip all of that in Swedish. Fortunately, a verb has only one ending per tense, so that's super cool. And at the same time, the nouns are relatively easy. What other languages call cases. Fortunately, Swedish has abundant. If you don't know what that is, good. You will not need to think about these things in the Swedish language. There are a few things that are a little bit tricky. For example, Swedish words do have a gender. Swedish nouns, they have a gender, like a table in English is not female or something like that, but in Swedish, we have actually 2 grammatical genders, a bit like in Spanish, a bit like in French, or also in German, where we have 3 grammatical genders. Swedish has 2. That can be a little bit confusing because you have to learn the gender with the noun. There is no sense in the distribution. So, for example, we would say en stol, and there is no reason why it shouldn't be ett stol, but ett stol is just wrong. So you have to learn the gender of the noun, and that can be a little bit confusing. Also, prepositions are a little bit complicated. Prepositions are all these small words like on, under, before, after, and so on. And sometimes it's really not logical why we would choose a specific preposition in Swedish. For example, how do we translate the English in, like in the kitchen? Yeah, you see, sometimes not very logical at all. We just have to learn these things by heart, and that can be a little bit tricky. Still, I would say Swedish grammar is not so complicated, but it has its confusing parts, and I suggest that you check out my survival guide to basic Swedish grammar anywhere. What is more confusing, though, is the pronunciation. There are a couple of sounds that don't exist in the English language, and we have to learn those, whether we want to or not. Otherwise, we're going to sound very odd. And also, the writing is not always super consistent. So it's a little bit more consistent than in English. But sometimes we don't know when we see a word how it's written. We don't know 100% for sure how to pronounce it. So this can also be a little bit of a challenge when we're learning Swedish. Lastly, Swedish does have a number of dialects. So you have the same issue in English when you're traveling throughout England and Scotland and Wales. People speak English in a different way. When you go to the United States, it still sounds very different. When you go to Australia, so if you have learned one version of the English language, it can be tricky to understand all the other ones. And that's the same in Sweden. So you have a variety of dialects. Swedish sounds different, whether you are in Malmö in the south or in Kiruna in the north. But fortunately, there is something that's called riksvenska, which is like a standard version of spoken Swedish. And that's really, really helpful because people can switch to the standard version. And that's the version that most Swedish courses, like our story-based course, will also teach. So you're good to go if you know how to use riksvenska, because that's basically what will be used by all Swedish speakers, even if they use a dialect in situations like, for example, together with their family. So all in all, I would say Swedish is not a very difficult language. Feel free to check out the free resources on my channel and subscribe to it to get more info about the Swedish language.